Good day and welcome to the Patently Strategic Podcast, where we discuss all things at the intersection of business, technology, and patents. This podcast is a monthly discussion amongst experts in the field of patenting. It is for inventors, founders, and IP professionals alike, established or aspiring. And let me tell you, it is so good to be back and officially kicking off our second season after taking a brief post-holiday break. This is going to be an incredible follow-up to our inaugural season. So many great topics in store for you, including upcoming deep dives into the patent metaverse, compelling interviews with impactful up-and-coming inventors, and a tour of the costly misconceptions around patent ownership. But first, today, our experts tackle software protection. As Silicon Valley engineer and investor Marc Andreessen famously said, software is eating the world. It's central to so much of today's innovation, and the growth potential is off the charts. Despite recent rate hikes rattling the market a bit, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Tesla, these 5 companies, all with software at their core, are worth a quarter of the S&P's entire market cap. It's possible that Meta Platforms, formerly known as Facebook, could soon be the 6th such company worth over $1 trillion. In our microcosm of focus, these eye-popping stats are no exception. The AI-powered market will grow to $180 billion by 2025. By the end of this year, the global edge computing market will reach $6.72 billion, and the global AR and VR market will exceed $209 billion. By 2030, there will be 50 billion IoT devices in use worldwide. That's 6 devices each for every man, woman, and child on this planet, and all of them are powered by software. The stakes are high, the value is soaring, and the importance of quality patenting has never been more strategically vital. In this month's episode, Dr. Ashley Sloat, President and Director of Patent Strategy here at Aurora, leads a discussion along with our all-star patent panel, digging into the social and legal issues surrounding software patents, strategies for how to protect software innovations, and a great overview of IP implementation concerns and strategies as they pertain to outsourcing, code ownership, agile methodologies, and open source use. The group also concludes with an insightful brainstorming session around 2 problems that plague this space. The first is around a new patent type that would help overcome many of the current prosecution and court problems faced by software patents. The second, pulling from adjacent IP law, is a mechanism for small inventors to receive compensation for using their patents, similar to how music copyright royalties are handled. Ashley is joined today by our always exceptional group of IP experts, including David Cohen, Principal at Cohen Sciences, Shelley Couturier, Patent Strategist and Search Specialist at Aurora, Amy Fine, Patent Attorney at Vancott and Adjunct Professor at BYU, Kristen Hansen, Patent Strategist and newest member of the Aurora family, David Jackrell, President of Jackrell Consulting, and Daniel Wright, Partnership Manager and Patent Strategist here at Aurora. All right, take it away, Ashley.
The things I want to talk about with software is very, very briefly touch on the social and legal issues, because you all know what those are, but just more to kind of bring everybody with the second part of the presentation. And then how to protect software innovations. I think we're all pretty clear on what those options are, but again, just a brief touch on them. But then the bigger part that I want to talk about is the implementation concerns and strategies. Some of these things were things that were, I think, cursory thoughts, but, digging into them more, you can kind of see some of the nitty gritty of it. And so I think this last piece is kind of some of the more eye-opening or interesting topics for conversation. So, of course, with software patents, I think some of the interesting dynamics are that, socially, there are kind of sort of 2 camps, some that fully believe that software should be patent protected. And there's another group of individuals who think that, software should be an open source. And basically both want to promote access to software, but they basically believe that it should be gone about in 2 different ways. One is, make it open source and anybody can build upon it, easy peasy. The other one believes that you file patents and then you can still give access to people, but you still are protecting your base innovation. So I think that these groups want kind of the same thing, but they also want to go about it in 2 different ways. And then legally, obviously, there's some issues around the Alice decision and that some of the complexities and uncertainty that put into the patent system around software patenting. And then, of course, all the case law from the court system, the federal circuit, has only increased that ambiguity. And then, PTAB obviously adds additional ambiguity as well, because handling things in a little bit different way, it's a little bit different perspective and trying to make heads or tails of it. And really, at the end of the day, we do have some broader overarching ideas, but still there's some case law out there where, even some of the ones that I read I look at some of the ones that are, invalidated. I'm like, that's ridiculous. And then you look at some of the other ones that were held up and you're like, that's ridiculous. So there's still some weird stuff where I just, I don't feel like there's a good consensus between the courts about how that shall be handled. But anyways, we know what, of course, we all do know is that there's a lot of ineligibility happening in the software space. Lots of patents are being found invalid, either, in the USPTO or at the PTAB or at the Federal Circuit, basically on all levels. There's, some degree of, I would say, higher ineligibility than eligibility with software patents. So I think it does beg the question on like how to remedy that. And I do have some thoughts, like I said, at the end to talk through. But of course, and then as we all know, the main root of the problem is that software does fall into one of the four categories: process, machine, manufacturer, composition of matter. Obviously, likely a machine or a process. But the courts have this implicit exception, one of them being abstract ideas, and software tends to fall into that. But despite all that, even with that history, even with the social pressures that are happening, software is routinely protected through utility patents. It's routinely protected through design patents, like the ornamental aspects of animations or graphical user interfaces. You can do trademarks for your software. You can even do trade secret, depending, and then copyright for unique software code expressions. So I think, it still is very protectable, but I think, where I want to go with this presentation now is some of the intricacies of copywriting software versus patenting software, and what are some of the gotchas. So these are some things, like I said, as I dug into them more, there were some things where I think if a person or an inventor or a company is unwary, they could get caught in a problematic situation. So
Ashley, can I interrupt you real quick? You listed GUIs under design patents, and you can do that, but graphical user interfaces can also be under utility because there's so much utility underneath them, the code, the algorithms and stuff. So it could be either. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's where the interesting line blurs a little bit between utility and design, because separating that ornamental aspect from the functional aspect too, and how do you tout the functional aspect versus the ornamental aspect in any kind of consumer facing documentation and things like that, and making sure you're kind of being careful about how you do that. So obviously, you all probably know this, but copyrights are meant for the literal expression of the idea. So like the literal expression of software code is more protectable by copyright. And so it's guarding against exact replication or derivations of that. And patents protect the broader idea, right? That no matter how it's implemented, if it's different languages or maybe different ways of, reducing it to practice, it doesn't really matter unless your claims have that specific reduction to practice, right? Unless you very specifically say you have to do X, Y, and Z, and there's only one way to do X, Y, and Z with code. So some of the interesting thing is that I think agile development has brought in a lot of interesting opportunities for the patent process. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the agile process, but it obviously encourages fast-paced work cycles. So historically, they had, like, I think what they called the waterfall development, where you basically the team that was deciding what the product features would be, they would basically plan out the entire product and then throw it over the wall to the developers. And then, some years later, the developers would emerge with a product, and that product didn't necessarily account for real-time feedback or usability or consumer feedback or changes in the product pathway or anything like that. So it kind of caused this problem that, you needed to iterate on more smaller segments of software to get it to be where you want it to be for consumers. And so it's faster paced work cycles, rapidly evolving objectives. You can change what each segment of the product, how it behaves and how it looks based on consumer feedback to the prior iteration or additional feedback that happens later on. So it's just easier to kind of evolve the product over time. They also do very stringent resource prioritization. So, putting developers on that, that cycle at that time, and then reallocating them to the next one, and, and tying it together. So, and then incremental completion. So again, continuous delivery of smaller portions. And then, so I think this creates a problem in the sense that it's harder to know when there's enough there to protect if you're only seeing these little bits happening from a software development cycle. From an IP perspective, it might, without the trees, or sorry, without the forest, it might be hard to see the trees. And so being able to kind of see both aspects of it through this incremental development and making sure that you're abreast with the development team as they're developing, as objectives change, as prioritization change, as features change, making sure that you're kind of on board with the development team to see what happens when. And then, of course, there's the risk with early disclosure and customer feedback. With these shorter sprints, you're getting more feedback, potentially at shorter intervals. You're pushing it out to consumers potentially. In theory, this is all experimental use, but in the event that it's not, that you're actually selling it, and still doing customer testing and feedback, this could also, present problems for clients as well. And then lastly, of course, we always have, I think we all experience this a lot. Inventors always want to self-censor and say, well, it's just a simple thing. Like everybody does this in software. Everybody uses this code to do this, or everybody does that. But again, in the bigger pie, in the bigger forest, does that, the way they've used that code, make a difference? Does their implementation make a difference? So here's kind of one example of agile software. And so obviously many companies do this differently. But what I think is probably the most, useful places for IP input is that you're going to look for it. So you have the requirements and user input. So of course, us being involved in that process, I think is really important because you're starting to understand what's the problem that they're solving, what's the product that they want to build, what do the users want out of this product. But then, it's really the planning phase when they're starting to think about how they're going to reduce it to practice, or what are the chunks, the different sprints that they're going to do. I think that's a great point for us as practitioners to step in and start to identify where there might be protectable elements. And then, of course, as development sprints happen, you're going to start to see actually how things play out in terms of how they're actually developed. So you may say that the problem to solve is this, or we want to solve it via that. But of course, as all software development can be really difficult at times, they're going to encounter different problems, different technical problems that we can, evaluate from a patentability perspective, at each development sprint or each development cycle. And then, lastly, with user review, if they're pushing it out to users for beta testing, or if they're having internal people do it, or if, however they're getting that, test group feedback, obviously, you're going to want to do that before they push it out. And you're definitely going to want to do it before they release it. And then lastly, I think the retrospective is interesting because that allows everybody to weigh in on whether, how things went. Did they go well? Did they not go well? Did things behave like they wanted it to? Or what were alternatives to what were done? And so I think even in the retrospective phase could be a valuable place to see if there is IP, just because I think that could be an opportunity to define what alternatives there may be. Because I know just different developers are going to tackle a problem in a different way. And so through that retrospective, different developers are going to hopefully speak up and say, I like the way you did that, but I would have done it this way differently. So that's just one example where I think we can kind of play into the software development cycle. And so then again, like just, going after this, further is that I think from a software, if you look at each of one of these data points as a sprint, so you have 4 sprints shown, you really could have multiple provisionals being filed and then all being wrapped up into one utility right before release, and also you could, of course, abandon different provisionals at different times without really any penalty. So I think that also, being able to do these smaller chunks of software patents, I think, with the bigger goal in mind, with the bigger product in mind, with the bigger problems to be solved in mind, with, really making sure you're seeing the forest.
Yeah, I agree, Ashley. This is a good strategy, especially with the provisionals earlier, because the biggest buzzsaw that I see clients run into with agile development in-house is losing foreign protection because you've inadvertently disclosed.
Right.
So you get to the end or you get to the middle and you can't actually go after foreign rights because you've inadvertently disclosed or behind a flag or whatever. And in software, it's really, really difficult to prove it was experimental use. It's so easy to get to, it's so easy to release, right?
Right. Does user agreements help with that, Kristen? Do a lot of companies put stuff in their user agreements that say anything like that? And does that, if that's...
You can, as long as you're under NDA, and I believe of course, no sales, but as long as you're under NDA and you haven't sold it, and I believe, I'm trying to think what else, but definitely NDA, you want to be careful because that isn't truly a release to public, right? So then you can protect a lot more further back. But if you have these provisionals going along, as long as you don't go past your 1 year of that prior one, you can go back and get all of that protection in a foreign space. The bigger problem, though, is they often want to release full products at each little tick because it's usually an app or it's something that, does 5 things and they're working on 1 of 5, right? And so that's kind of hard even to write a provisional about a simple thing if it doesn't seem all that inventive at first glance.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's cheaper than normal provisional. I don't know.
Do you see a lot of, in that world, do you see a lot of continuations in part that, before publication dates and stuff like that to try to capture?
I do. Well, you can do it that way, and it's kind of unfortunate because you do lose some stuff. But more often than not, I see because they've taken an agile approach to software, they've lost a huge chunk of their invention. And so they have to take this point and go forward, and they can only invent and claim forward.
Right.
So sometimes that means you only get a couple of methods. You don't get a fully functional piece of software. You just get a few algorithms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's tougher. But if your people know, if you tell them you're going to run into form filing problems, if you don't disclose early and often to your IP team, if you don't think about these things early, it could be a problem. And basically, you can look at this from a PowerPoint at a product developer or product management level. When those steps are being presented to the company internally, an IP attorney or IP agent can take that slide deck and pull out what they think might be inventive, and then have those quick inventor discussions to see if they are indeed something new that is not yet released.
Right.
That's what we did at Scientific Atlanta. We had every product management meeting, we had the IP guy right there. He was part of the meeting. So we would, even as a product manager, that was our goal, to look at anything inventive and then send it off immediately.
Okay, so being then inside counsel would send that to outside counsel, and outside counsel can be paid to do the due diligence, to follow up, to do some interviews. And sometimes it doesn't turn into an application, but it's still a couple hours of analysis and interviews. It's still a feed structure of work, even if it doesn't turn into a patent. But
I think it's the hard part is, as getting companies and inventors to be more inclusive in the sense of, bringing legal counsel along for the ride a little bit, because I think it's just an extra step, an extra burden. But I think the payoff can be really big, as Kristen and Shelley, you're both pointing out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so this, some of this, I guess, kind of goes to like the user agreement stuff, as having some of that NDA language in there, and that any of the feedback that that your client's going to be receiving can be incorporated into the product, can be used in the product, and it's without royalties or payment, because you are going to be getting feedback from consumers around different product sets and different improvements to be made, and so you definitely want your client to own that. So I think, again, it's not like we're going to draft this language for them as agents, but I think making sure your client is thinking through all of the contracts. Like, I think the more and more I deal with, especially like small companies or solos, the more I'm surprised that a lot of them don't have basic agreements. I spoke to a gentleman the other day who has been working with another individual to build, and this wasn't software, this was an actual device, but hadn't done an agreement with that gentleman with his company. And so if that person became disgruntled later and decided that, whatever he brought to the table was valuable enough and he didn't want to assign it or something, now you have this weird issue. And so I think really reinforcing the clients, the value in contracts, NDAs, contracts, work for hire, all that kind of stuff, and making sure they have it's not like we have to do that, we're not going to be doing that work, but I think we all view ourselves as responsible for them, hopefully conducting their business in a responsible way. And sometimes that means reminding them that they need certain contracts and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure.
They haven't gotten yet. Okay, some open source considerations. This is probably the most like eye-opening thing to me, I guess, a little bit. I mean, not like the copyleft stuff and things like that, but so anyways, so obviously, there's open source licenses. These are royalty-free copyright licenses granting third parties the rights to copy, modify, and distribute computer code with strings attached that are dependent on the type of source code that you're using. Most of us are probably familiar with copyleft, where, essentially if you incorporate copyrighted software into your software, then you have to distribute that software with the same parameters as the copyleft source code. So essentially you have to make your software open source, which I'm sure your client would generally not like. Or maybe they do have certain portions of it, but to have to make their whole code base, open source would not be ideal. So, and I think, other questions that we get from clients is that, whether open source can be patented. And so it can be and is often patented. And so it just depends on how you're using it, how you're extending beyond that open source. Because obviously that open source software code is available to the public. So, I mean, I view it as a published prior art document for all intents and purposes. And so, how is your client actually using that open source code, and how are they extending beyond it? How are they incorporating it into their product? How are they using it? All that kind of stuff. And so it does, but there are built into open source. Again, this depends on the license. So you want your clients to be able to read that and weigh the implications of that license. There's a lot of times some kind of express or implied license grant in open source software. So if your client is incorporating it, they're likely fine to do that. But again, they just need to understand what the license says and the requirements of that license. And then interestingly, there's also patent retaliation clauses. So if your client attempts to assert infringement against the OSS developer, there's clauses in there that can prevent that kind of activity. So again, it's kind of a two-way street of, yes, you can use this, but I'm also protected from you doing something silly later against me. So the way I view it, and this is like, for whatever reason, this last year, I've seen a lot of this come through. And so that's also probably why we prepared this talk for another group, is just that, again, from a contract perspective, you see a lot of clients having software developed for like non-technical founders or founders who don't have the time to actually do the technical aspects of their product. They outsource it, but then they don't do the contracts needed to protect themselves. Because, as I'm sure you all appreciate, when you come into a relationship with a dev shop, they have their own code, right? They have their code bases that they use, because a lot of times they build kind of similar products for a lot of different businesses, or, if they're all doing mobile applications, they may have like a base mobile application data, code set that they use, and then they build upon that for specific clients. There's also open source that they be pulling from. And I don't know any developer that doesn't pull from open source, because it'd be silly not to, because it just gives you such a bump in how much code you can develop and how quickly you can. Then also, as a part of the relationship that you're going to form with a dev shop, there's also going to be new code generated that's specific to your product. And so the product obviously lies somewhere in that Venn diagram of the dev shop code, the source code, and your new code. And so what I think people don't fully always realize is that, you need to have contracts in place to make sure that the new code is controllable by your client, making sure that whatever contract is created, make sure that any new code that's developed as part of that product is controllable by your client, or, has the IP rights are assigned to your client. You have to make sure that they're complying with the open source licensing structure. And then, there's also the dev shop. The dev shop has to be brought along in this process and making sure that they're complicit in whatever agreement is set up. We had a client come to us where, they had come to us right before a conversion event, and they had a product developed. They paid the development company for the software development, but this company had obviously base code that they were developing off of. They do, a lot of like ML stuff for a lot of different companies. And there was no development agreement up front. So then when it came time to conversion, when we're trying to figure out assignments and all that kind of stuff, the dev shop says, no, it's built on our base code. We own it. Our client is saying, no, I paid you for all of this. We own it. and, you know, and it was an amicable relationship, right? I think even the dev shop had like invested in this company, and, you know, they had a really hard time coming to terms. And ultimately the terms we came to, which was not ideal, but better than nothing, was that the dev shop and the client company became co-owners of the IP. But from like a licensing, investor, acquisition perspective, it could be really problematic that that structure exists. And so it just really underscored the need for there to be some kind of agreement up front that says, we understand, dev shop, that you're bringing this to the table. You understand that we're bringing this to the table and paying you for certain things. And then the thing that's developed out of this relationship, who owns that? What does that mean? Whose name is listed on IP? You know, how is that controllable? Whatever. And you'd be surprised, you know, at least I was, I guess, this last year has been a really big eye opener for me about how many companies don't set up this way. They don't do these due diligence steps early on, and it creates problems that we have to fix later, which can be really difficult. So, and then anyways,
actually, before you go on, I'm remembering, it's reminding me of the recent case with Java and Google and Android.
yeah.
Right? So, I mean, like, I know that decision was really controversial, but I mean, it seems very tricky. That previous Venn diagram you had, especially with the open source compliance stuff, it seems, I don't do a ton of software work, but in the, in that decision and some other conversations we've had and such, like, it seems that there's a lot of gray area. Do you agree? I mean, with that? So everybody familiar for Kristen, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I have prosecuted for Google since about 2005, 6.
Oh, nice.
And they are very touchy about this, so much so that they have a lot of partnerships. They do a lot of this sort of combination where the dev shop code isn't a dev shop, it's another company, or it's another set of inventors, or it's another product or piece that they're going to acquire or they're looking at acquiring, and they will actually go together and file IP. They do that out of hope to get something, usually from the engineering team and the development side, and to get that skill set in-house. It's rather than the IP that would come from it immediately, right? So future IP that maybe isn't quite related to that or is a little bit different, then they do have rights to that, right, after they've acquired. But from an open source standpoint, they just pay attention when it comes to IP. They're very, very well versed in what they can and cannot do. So much so that even their engineers have a clue about when they're using open source, when they're creating open source, what they can release, what can go behind a flag, for example, on Chrome, and what cannot. They're hugely paying attention. But even that, it happens to them. So, the thing is to avoid it, but they also want to be part of that industry. So it's really hard to avoid.
Yeah. So from your experience and perspective, I don't know if you know this Google versus Oracle decision from April, but essentially, like, I guess it was the Supreme Court. Yeah, the Supreme Court said that Google was not infringing, or rather that Oracle didn't have a right, or that the patent was valid, I guess is maybe what the decision was, because even though it was hundreds and hundreds of lines, maybe thousands of lines of code, it was somehow like not integral, or like,
because it was the APIs, right?
Sorry?
It wasn't because they said, because it was the APIs, which are like not, they never spoke to the copyrightable of APIs, right, but basically said because it was like an organizational scheme, and even though, like I said, it was like a huge percentage of the actual code base. It was insane, but yeah,
it was an API and not something that they were privy to. They were just using it.
Right.
So does that
the whole point of Java is their API structure?
This OSS compliance, I mean, is, by your understanding and everything, is Google in compliance? I mean, were they doing all that properly, and Oracle was in the wrong?
I don't know, because I know how Google normally works, and they normally would comply with any and all things like that, because they would usually be the big dog that someone was trying to sue, right?
Yeah.
So they work really hard to not work in that space if they don't have to, but to also share when they can. But honestly, it's a matter of who's using what, how they're using it, and how much access they had to it as a matter of right. So if it's true open source, it's usable and it's viewable, right? I can see the code in that API, which is usually not the case, but true open source code, that's how I look at it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
I mean,
But that's also, if you look at kind of what went on there and what has gone on in similar situations, that's how standards are born too sometimes.
yeah.
And when it becomes a standard, people are like, well, we're not going to pay for it, right? It's just a standard, and it's just a little different path, right?
Where I think it gets a little tricky, at least, from the clients I've dealt with, is that how do you ensure, because a lot of times, with software, you got to express the base technology and the actual product, right? Like, you can't just do it at such a high level that you're like, here's the product that the dev shop made for us, and here's just that piece. But a lot of times you need to, like, if like in this case, it was like base ML programs and things like that were being used in an ML centric applied ML case. You still have to go into the details of the ML, right? How it's trained,
Sure.
how it's used, how it's whatever. And so I think where a lot of the gray area, speaking to your point, David, that came into this case was that in order for us to effectively claim and draft about the new code that was developed for our client, we had to disclose to some degree the code that was the base code that the dev shop brought.
Right.
And so
you had to.
Yeah, and then how do you future proof for that dev shop? Because the dev shop doesn't want to later. You have claims that are broad that could be applied to any case when they've used that code for other clients.
So you do have to enable everything, but sometimes your machine learning is not novel because it's not a new network. It's kind of off the shelf, if you will. Right. It's not newly trained, except for it happens to be on your data, right? But it's not a new kind of data or it's not a new problem solved. But you can claim that you're receiving this content, gathering this data, you're putting it into some sort of neural network system or some sort of machine learning, right, black box, and something is created out of that, and you do something with what's created out of that. So that's kind of another way to claim that without saying, I've invented this neural network, I've invented this machine learning process.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there definitely is some ways, but it just, I know in my experience too with the patent office with machine learning and AI though too, it's just like a generic recitation of an off-the-shelf ML AI is not enough. They still want to know the details, even if it is off the shelf. They want to know the details of how it's done, either in the spec and then maybe even to some degree in the claims. And so it gets to that weird. So I mean, in that client's case, maybe the co-ownership was appropriate because at some point the client decides to be super broad and just say this ML system, then the other party can say, whoa, we own that patent because that was our base tech, I don't know. It's weird. It's definitely.
When I do claim that for somebody who is kind of using an off-the-shelf thing that they've trained just a little differently, I will put the actual machine learning pieces in a dependent claim. I try really hard to keep it out, and sometimes I just explain it in the specification and leave it at that.
Right.
Just because it really wasn't the crux of their invention, right?
Right. I do kind of want to get your guys' thoughts on this stuff. This is just, two things I've been thinking about recently is one, should there be like a specific software patent, not so like there, so in the world of utility patents, there would, or like patents in general in the US, for example, there would be a design patent, there would be a utility patent that covered biotech and diagnostics and that kind of stuff. And again, it gets a little weird with digital health and stuff like that, right? But then there should be like, there's some other kind of software patent where like you don't have to worry about 101 then, because that's the whole reason for that patent class is it's for software patenting. And maybe it has like a shorter time frame, and maybe it's renewable after some time period. Because that's the other thing, you know, software is so quickly iterative that I can imagine a lot of software patents would be obsolete in 10 years just because, you know, software has expanded beyond that. Or and then like, you know, could you link to some kind of like code repository or code listing if it were open source to further enable it? You know, so I don't know, just something, you know, because it would obviously remove all the section 101 issues, because that would be the whole purpose of that patent. So it'd really be just down to novelty, obviousness, disclosure, enablement, and things like that. So that's one point for discussion. The other point is, you know, I think the unfortunate part of the patent system is that a lot of small inventors it's really hard for them to even recoup their costs of getting a patent, and they may be super innovative, but then the bigger companies do tend to just squash them and suffocate them in fees and courts and IPRs and all that kind of stuff. So we recently just heard, like, I didn't know much about this, but we were listening to this werewolf song on the way back from a cider mill this weekend. And it's the exact same opening riff as Kid Rock. It was one of Kid Rock's songs. But of course, this werewolf song was like crazy old, and Kid Rock's song was like not crazy old. So we're like, you know, we were like sitting in the vehicle thinking, how did Kid Rock, you know, did he just take this and use it and say, screw you, earlier song, I'm just going to use your copyrighted song? Or did he actually be responsible and pay royalties and everything? Well, what came out of our little research in the vehicle was that the copyright world, especially for music, I don't know if this transcends into other types of copyright, but they have a statutory mechanical royalty rate that is set forth by the Copyright Arbitration Royalty Panel for compulsory mechanical licenses. So basically, assuming that a work has been previously released to the public, this is a licensing fee the licensee can pay to sell a cover version of a song without having to obtain direct permission from the rights holder. So in the US, this rate is, 9.1 cents per track or 1.75 cents per each minute of playing time, whichever is greater. So I'm just wondering, to make it more fair for like smaller inventors, smaller companies, is there a world where we need to have some kind of like statutory rate where, if we assume all patents are valid because they did go through this crazy patent office procedure, before you release the product, do you go through some kind of diligence? And if you find patents that reasonably cover what you're doing, even if you can maybe make an argument that the one word in the patent that you may or may not do, is there some base rate that you have to pay to that inventor? Because it assumes that the USPTO did its job correctly. It assumes the patent is valid. It assumes everybody was good actors, and it allows for at least some cost to be recuperated by sole inventors. I don't know, just weird things I've been thinking about lately. So curious about your thoughts on the whole software patent idea and the statutory rate idea for patents.
The software, like patent copyright sort of idea, it just reminds me of, and this is a really odd thing, I haven't dealt with this a lot, but I know of, in the semiconductor world, there's something called a mask work. So, like Intel, designs a processor, and it could have 100 steps in the process, and each one of those is a pattern that needs a mask. And it all fits together in this big 3D layout. And it's like, sure, there's lots of patentable technology in there, but it's almost like a whole separate thing. How do you get everything to fit on one chip? How big do you make this line? How big do you make that line? What do you put next to each other? And there's a lot of sort of design, innovation, whatever in that. So it's basically just a copyright, though. It's a mask where it's not even a design patent where there's like a claim, what we show in these figures, or however you word that in design patent. In a mask work, apparently it's just like a copyright, but it's I guess a vehicle for a specific mask set in the semiconductor world. I wonder if there could be a special software copyright or something that would do something similar.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I think pulling from these different spaces, because I think there is an issue with software patents. Yeah, and I know like there's been a lot of success, but I think there could be something better, or at least like parallel, another track for people to take. So I think that's really, I want to look into that more and see how that's done, because I think that's really interesting.
So I'm a huge dissenter of this idea, but most of it is this. I've written code, I've designed consumer products myself, and then I've moved into the patent world and done everything with, that you could possibly do with software there. And this is my argument. This phone, this is a paperweight without software. It's a piece of metal. It's a chunk of nothing. It needs the software to do what it does. That's a utility.
Right.
And so if you then move and you say, okay, let's go online and talk about some HTML code that sends me an email, okay, that is no longer a definitive device. It isn't like a widget as a mechanical design, right, or a mechanical patent. It's kind of in the ether, right?
Right.
But the engineering behind that has an algorithm and has a design, and it took an input, it created an output, and it created a display of an output. So those really are the three things that you typically do with anything outside of mechanical. Mechanical can just be a widget, right? But almost every other piece of a patent would be take an input, do something, provide an output. And that's what software does. And most of our devices without software are just bricks.
Right. That's where it falls apart a little bit for me, but where, unfortunately, I don't think the courts are viewing, that's where there was one of the cases that it was a camera, like the device was directed to a camera, but it was to like a way to get better, crisper images with a camera or something like that. And it was held invalid by either the district court or I think it was the federal circuit. And like, to me, that's like so far beyond abstract idea because it's a camera, and again, I think there's some conflagration of 101, 102, and 103, which is causing some of these issues as well. And like enablement and sufficiency of disclosure, all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But like, they're not fixing it in that way like they should. So I guess this is like an end around of like, if y'all aren't going to fix it like you should, do we just go around you and do something different?
Okay. I understand.
I know what you mean. I think there's like a lot of issues with Alice, with how it conflates 102 and 103 with 101 and all those things. But Kristen and Ashley, I mean, like, I totally agree. And like, there's a lot of innovation that happens when you write code. Yeah. And so I think part of AI is a great example too. It's like, I think most people, the examiner, the inventor, the agent, attorney, would all agree there is something here that's been invented. But I think where everybody gets hung up, at least the examiner and the agent or attorney, is in the claim language itself. Right. How did you write it down so that it is only covering that real thing that you invented and not other crazy abstract ideas or other things that are out there or whatever? And that's where I think in the semiconductor world, again, I'm much more on the material side and the device side, but in the semiconductor world, there's a lot of stuff when you design a chip that is patentable, but then there's this whole other component of it, which is how does everything fit together? Mm-hmm. Which is sort of, how do you write that in a claim? God, I mean, it would be like thousands and thousands of lines long to capture all of those design intricacies. So maybe a situation where there's like value for both sorts of things. There's value in figuring out what is the crux of the innovation that you've done here with this code that no one else has been able to do. Oh, take this kind of input and display it in a certain way or process it differently or whatever. There also could be value in, somebody else, it might have taken them 20,000 lines to write this code. I did it in 4,000 because I figured out a very efficient way to organize everything or whatever. And that might be where like a mask work or like a software copyright in a way is like, could be a complementary, right, to a
yes. Yeah, I like this as an alternative. I don't like it on its own, but I do like it as an alternative, especially with somebody who either doesn't want to pay to argue over Alice or doesn't know how to argue over Alice, right? And doesn't have enough in their specification to get them anywhere.
Right.
And to your point about really lengthy claims. That is how we got over Alice when it first came out. The first year or two, you just kept adding on another dongle. I mean, it was awful, and you would get the worst claims because you didn't want to get the client nothing. I did a lot of work for SAP back then, and that's business method stuff, and they were attacked horribly every time they went anywhere with a claim set.
That's interesting. Well, I may bump y'all because I've been like really thinking about this, and I think there's like opportunity for some kind of like bigger discussion about like just alternatives, like even just to put my mind at rest at night about these things. What are people's thoughts on this? And I know we have to probably get going here, but anybody's thoughts on a statutory rate for the patent world? I don't know how it would be policed or set up or whatever. I think it's interesting.
It's tough. I mean, the one challenge might be beyond something like in the music industry. And a song is a song. Right. It kind of has a standard scope, if you will. Certain markets you can go into, whatever. With a lot of software and things like that, how do you decide on, is it the same rate for, a little piece of software in a sensor of a little photo detector, some super simple thing versus like a computer or phone or like an operating system or something?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
So a piece of that you have to remember when talking to any of your software clients, if somebody comes to you with something that works way in the back end of the computer and you cannot detect it, that's a terrible claim.
Right.
You don't even want to go after that. That's just somebody who needs to bulk up their portfolio. It's really useless to have a non-detectable claim because who's going to infringe and how are you going to find it, right?
I just don't know how to solve the problem. There's just so many small inventors, small companies that develop really great stuff, and other, bigger companies that just can move way faster, have bigger budgets, have bigger purses, just pick it up and do it, and then smother them with IPRs and court cases. And I know AIA was supposed to fix some of that, but I think it just made it worse. And then I was just reading last night some of the newer reforms that Leahy and the other one are suggesting, in my opinion, would actually make it even worse, where it would be like even easier to institute PTAP proceedings, and it would be even easier to cancel claims, and be, all these things that would make it even harder, I think, for smaller inventors to really protect themselves. So like, I definitely get a few phone calls, a year at least, if not more, where you have these inventors that really seem to have a legit thing. And I connect them with people that do litigation, things like that. By the end of the day, nobody wants to pick up litigation on a like, if we win kind of basis, then you have to pay us. But if not, like contingency basis, there we go. That's the word. So like, what's the remedy, for the small guys? Anywho, well, thanks for entertaining me all today.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. It's a great topic.
Yeah. Anybody have anything else they want to talk about? Add?
I think you should write an article about this, Ashley.
That's I think we're thinking about doing, because we've been, I don't know, like I said, just I've been doing more bigger thinking, I don't know, about things, and these are things that keep me up at night, literally. But putting something together. So I mean, I'm saying, like, Kristen, if you have some thoughts, anybody has some thoughts, let me know, because I'll do one like by everybody article, and everybody weighs in on like porting over some of these other concepts into patent law and stuff. Because some of the stuff that they're suggesting right now in Congress, I'm like, dear Lord, you all have no idea what you're putting your finger into, and how you're messing it up, so maybe it does nothing, but at least, like I said, it helps me sleep better at night. So, all right. Well,
thank you. Great.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you. Nice to meet everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and remember to check us out at aurorapatents.com for more great podcasts, blogs, and videos covering all things patent strategy. And if you're an agent or attorney and would like to be part of the discussion, or an inventor with a topic you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcast@aurorapatents.com. Do remember that this podcast does not constitute legal advice, and until next time, keep calm and patent on.